Karen had always been the kind of person who thrived on knowing what everyone else was up to. She wasn't mean-spirited, exactly, just overly curious. Her days revolved around keeping tabs on her neighbors, whether it was noticing when someone painted their front door a new color or spotting an unfamiliar car parked in a driveway. It wasn't uncommon to see Karen peeking out from behind her lace curtains with a cup of coffee in hand, scanning the street for anything out of the ordinary. Her house sat neatly at the corner of the cul-de-sac, surrounded by perfectly trimmed bushes and flower beds that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Every blade of grass was cut to the same height, every weed plucked before it could take root. Karen took immense pride in her yard, often boasting to anyone who would listen that she spent hours each week making sure everything looked just right. But as much as she cared about her own property, she seemed to care even more about everyone else's. When James Whittaker moved into the empty house across the street 6 months ago, Karen immediately pegged him as odd. He didn't throw wild parties or blast loud music late at night, but there was something about him that made her uneasy. For one thing, he kept to himself. Unlike most newcomers who eagerly introduced themselves and brought over plates of cookies or bottles of wine, James stayed quiet. He nodded politely if he passed someone on the sidewalk, but rarely stopped to chat. At first, Karen chalked it up to shyness. Maybe he was just adjusting to life in the suburbs after moving from somewhere busier, she thought. But as weeks turned into months, her curiosity grew into suspicion. Why did he never invite anyone over? Where did he go during those long walks he took every evening? And why did his garage light stay on until midnight some nights? The questions swirled in her mind, feeding her growing obsession with uncovering the truth. James wasn't completely invisible, though. Neighbors occasionally spotted him tending to his garden or tinkering with tools in his driveway. His yard wasn't messy, per se, but it certainly wasn't as pristine as Karen's. A few stray leaves littered the edges of his lawn, and his hedges hadn't been trimmed in what felt like ages. To Karen, these minor imperfections were glaring offenses, a blatant disregard for neighborhood standards. She couldn't understand how someone could live in such close proximity to her immaculate home and not feel compelled to match her level of dedication. One Saturday morning, as the sun bathed the neighborhood in golden light, Karen decided enough was enough. She grabbed her clipboard, the same one she used to keep track of HOA meetings, and marched across the street, determined to confront James about his unkempt yard. Little did she know, this seemingly simple interaction would spiral into something far beyond anything she could have imagined. Karen's footsteps crunched against the gravel of James' driveway as she approached his house, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. She had rehearsed what she was going to say on the walk over, calm but firm, polite but direct. After all, this wasn't personal. It was about maintaining neighborhood standards. At least, that's what she told herself. As she rounded the corner of the driveway, she spotted him sitting by the garage, leaning back in a folding chair with a book in his lap. He looked relaxed, almost serene, as if he didn't have a care in the world. The sight irritated her even more. How could he sit there reading while his yard practically begged for attention? Didn't he realize how much his neglect reflected on the rest of them? "Excuse me," Karen called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet morning air. James glanced up from his book, his expression calm and unreadable. He closed the book slowly, marking his page with a finger before setting it aside. "Yes," he said, his tone mild, almost amused. Karen planted her feet firmly on the ground, gripping her clipboard like a shield. "I need to talk to you about your yard," she began, her words clipped. "It's becoming an eyesore. Your hedges are overgrown, and there are leaves everywhere. You really should take better care of things." James tilted his head slightly, studying her as though she were speaking another language. Then, without missing a beat, he replied, "My yard isn't harming anyone. I think it looks fine." His voice was steady, confident, and infuriatingly calm. "Fine," Karen sputtered, taken aback by his nonchalance. "Fine doesn't cut it around here. We have standards, you know." People work hard to keep their properties looking nice. It's disrespectful to let yours go like this." James raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by her lecture. "Disrespectful," he repeated, his tone carrying just a hint of skepticism. "I pay my taxes, I follow the rules, and I don't bother anyone. If a few leaves on the ground are causing so much trouble, maybe the problem isn't with me." Karen bristled at his response. Who did he think he was, talking back to her like that? No one else in the neighborhood dared to challenge her when she pointed out flaws in their yards. Most people apologized and promised to fix whatever issue she brought up. But James was different. He wasn't backing down, and that only fueled her frustration further. "You're trespassing," she blurted out, pointing dramatically toward the edge of his driveway where she stood. Her face flushed red as she added, "This is private property, and I want you to leave right now." For a moment, James just stared at her, his lips curling into a faint smile. Then, in a voice so calm it bordered on mocking, he said, "Funny thing about that, I'm pretty sure this is my property. So technically, if anyone's trespassing." Before he could finish his sentence, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its tires whispering against the pavement. Two men stepped out, both dressed in dark suits and sunglasses, exuding an aura of authority that made Karen's stomach drop. She froze mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Whatever she had expected to happen next, this was not it. The arrival of the black sedan felt like something out of a movie, the kind Karen had only seen on TV during tense spy thrillers or political dramas. The car seemed to glide to a stop with an air of quiet importance, its polished surface gleaming under the bright morning sun. For a moment, everything around her seemed to freeze. The chirping birds, the rustling leaves, even the distant hum of lawnmowers in neighboring yards. All Karen could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Two men stepped out of the vehicle, their movements precise and deliberate. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed identically in sharp black suits that looked tailored to perfection. Dark sunglasses covered their eyes, giving them an almost robotic appearance, as though they weren't just ordinary people, but part of some elite force. One of them carried a small earpiece, its thin wire disappearing beneath his collar. The other held his hands clasped casually in front of him. Yet there was nothing casual about the way he scanned the area, taking in every detail with practiced efficiency. Karen's mouth hung open, her earlier bravado evaporating like mist in the sunlight. She hadn't expected this, not in a million years. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Why were these men here? And why did they step out of a car parked outside James' house? Her gaze darted between the two strangers and James, who still sat calmly by the garage, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. One of the suited men approached James first, leaning down slightly to speak into his ear. His voice was low, barely audible, but Karen strained to catch any words she could. Whatever he said made James nod once, his demeanor unchanged. Then, without warning, the man straightened up and turned toward Karen. His presence alone was intimidating enough, but when he spoke, his deep, authoritative voice sent a shiver down her spine. "Ma'am," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument, "we need you to step away for your own safety." Karen blinked, stunned. "Safety," she echoed, her voice cracking slightly. "What do you mean, safety? I'm not doing anything wrong." Her words came out louder than she intended, tinged with panic and confusion. She pointed accusingly at James, as if trying to remind everyone why she was there in the first place. "He's the one trespassing. He's refusing to leave my sight." The agent didn't flinch. Instead, he exchanged a brief glance with his partner before turning back to her. "Ma'am, please," he repeated, his patience wearing thin. "This is a secure situation. You need to return to your property immediately." Secure situation. The phrase hit Karen like a ton of bricks. What on earth did that mean? Was James involved in something dangerous? Illegal? Her thoughts spiraled wildly as fear began to creep in. Suddenly, the confrontation she'd started moments ago felt reckless and foolish. She glanced at James again, searching for answers in his calm, composed face, but he offered none. If anything, he looked almost amused by the turn of events. Her legs wobbled slightly as she took a hesitant step backward, then another. The agents didn't move to follow her, but their unwavering attention made it clear they weren't going to let her stay. As she retreated across the driveway, her clipboard dangling uselessly at her side, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled into something far bigger and far stranger than she ever could have imagined. Karen's mind was racing as she stumbled back toward her own yard, her earlier confidence completely shattered. She couldn't stop staring at the two men in suits, their presence commanding and unnerving. Every instinct told her to run inside, lock the door, and pretend this whole thing had never happened. But curiosity kept her rooted to the spot, unable to tear herself away from the scene unfolding across the street. James, still seated calmly by his garage, finally spoke up. His voice was smooth and measured, almost teasing. "You were saying?" he asked, glancing at Karen with a faint smirk playing on his lips. It wasn't malicious, more like the kind of amused expression someone might wear when watching a child try to argue with an adult. That look made Karen's cheeks burn even hotter than before. The agent who had addressed her earlier stepped forward again, his posture relaxed but authoritative. He turned his attention fully to James now, speaking quietly enough that Karen couldn't hear what they were saying. Whatever it was, James nodded along thoughtfully, occasionally murmuring something in response. The second agent remained near the car, his sharp eyes scanning the neighborhood for any signs of trouble. To Karen, it felt like the entire world had narrowed down to this one surreal moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first agent turned back to Karen. His tone was calm but firm as he addressed her once more. "Ma'am, I understand you're concerned about your neighbor's property," he said, gesturing vaguely toward James' yard. "But we need you to respect Mr. Whittaker's privacy moving forward. This is not a matter for public discussion." "Whittaker?" Karen repeated, her voice trembling slightly. She hadn't realized James went by a different last name, or maybe it wasn't his real name at all. Her head spun with questions. Who exactly was this man? Why did he have Secret Service agents accompanying him? And why did everyone seem so determined to protect him? Before she could ask anything out loud, the agent continued. "For your safety, and his, we recommend you avoid further interaction, unless absolutely necessary." There was no room for negotiation in his words. It was clear he expected her to comply without question. Karen swallowed hard, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. All her bravado had vanished, replaced by a mix of fear and embarrassment. She nodded weakly, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. "Oh, okay," she stammered. I'll leave him alone." With that, the agent gave her a curt nod and returned to the car. Both men climbed back inside, closing the doors with soft clicks that echoed louder than thunder in the otherwise quiet neighborhood. The engine purred to life, and the sleek black sedan pulled away from the curb, disappearing down the street as quickly as it had arrived. For several long moments, Karen stood frozen in place, her mind reeling. She looked over at James, who was now standing up and brushing off his jeans. He didn't say another word to her, simply picked up his book and headed back toward his house. As he walked away, Karen noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small, nearly invisible earpiece tucked into his ear. Her stomach dropped as the pieces started coming together. Whoever James Whittaker really was, he clearly wasn't just some ordinary neighbor trying to live a quiet life. As Karen finally forced herself to move, her legs wobbling beneath her, she couldn't help but wonder how much she didn't know about the people living right next door, and whether she truly wanted to find out. The neighborhood was buzzing within hours. Word spread faster than Karen could have imagined, fueled by whispers over backyard fences, hurried phone calls, and hushed conversations at the local coffee shop. By mid-afternoon, everyone knew. or thought they knew, what had happened. The story had morphed into something larger than life. Karen yelling at James in his own yard, only to be shut down by two Secret Service agents who appeared out of nowhere. Some versions even included wild embellishments, like claims that James had been hiding in plain sight as a high-profile government official, or that he'd uncovered some massive conspiracy. Of course, the truth wasn't far behind. Someone, a neighbor who swore they'd seen it on the news years ago, dug up an old article about Jonathan Hayes, a former government whistleblower who had exposed corruption at the highest levels. According to the report, Hayes had entered witness protection after receiving credible threats against his life. Suddenly, everything clicked. The quiet demeanor, the lack of visitors, the occasional late-night activity in his garage. It all made sense now. James Whittaker wasn't just a random guy trying to blend in. He was Jonathan Hayes, living under a new identity to stay safe. For Karen, the revelation hit like a ton of bricks. She replayed the confrontation in her mind over and over, cringing at every word she'd said. How could she have been so reckless? So blind? What if her shouting match with James had put him, or worse, the entire neighborhood, in danger? The weight of her actions settled heavily on her shoulders, leaving her feeling both foolish and ashamed. Other neighbors reacted differently. Some felt guilty for judging James based on superficial things, like his unkempt hedges or solitary habits. Others were fascinated by the idea of having someone so important and so secretive living among them. A few even joked nervously about how Karen's yard patrol had uncovered more than she bargained for. But despite the mix of emotions swirling through the community, one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. Karen spent the rest of the day avoiding eye contact with anyone who dared to look her way. She stayed indoors, pretending to busy herself with household chores, while secretly replaying the events in her head. Every knock at the door made her jump, convinced it was either James or another agent coming to give her a stern talking to. When evening finally fell, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, staring across the street at James' house. Lights glowed softly inside, but there was no sign of movement. It was almost as if nothing unusual had happened at all. As the days passed, the initial shock began to fade, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Neighbors tiptoed around the topic whenever James was nearby, unsure of how much he wanted people to know or guess. He didn't acknowledge the gossip directly, continuing his quiet routine as though nothing had changed. But Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she owed him something. An apology, maybe, or at least an explanation. It took her nearly a week to work up the courage, but eventually, she decided to confront her mistake head-on. One afternoon, armed with a plate of freshly baked cookies, her specialty, she crossed the street and knocked tentatively on James' door. Her heart pounded as she waited, half expecting him to slam the door in her face, or worse, call those agents back to escort her away. When James opened the door, he looked surprised but not angry. His expression softened slightly when he saw the cookies in her hands. "Peace offering?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Karen nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing red. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she stammered. "For everything. For yelling at you, for being nosy, for not realizing." She trailed off, unsure of how to finish without sounding even more foolish. James studied her for a moment, then stepped aside to let her in. "Come on in," he said simply. "We can talk." Karen hesitated for a split second before stepping inside, her heart still hammering in her chest. The interior of James' house was surprisingly warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, mysterious aura she'd imagined him living with. Soft light filtered through half-drawn curtains, illuminating cozy furniture and shelves lined with books. It looked like a home meant for quiet evenings and solitary reflection, a far cry from the life of intrigue and danger she'd built up in her mind. James gestured toward the couch, setting the plate of cookies on the coffee table. "Have a seat," he said, his voice calm but neutral. He didn't seem angry or resentful, just patient, as though he understood this moment had been inevitable. Karen sat down gingerly, clutching her hands together in her lap to keep them from trembling. "I really am sorry," she blurted out again, unable to hold back the words any longer. "I had no idea who you were, or what kind of situation you're in. If I'd known—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Well, I wouldn't have acted the way I did. I feel terrible." James leaned back in his chair, studying her with an unreadable expression. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, letting the weight of her apology hang in the air. Then, finally, he spoke. "It's okay," he said simply. "You weren't to know. And honestly, it's not the first time someone's reacted strongly to something they didn't understand." His tone wasn't dismissive, but it carried a note of finality, as if he'd already moved past the incident, while Karen was still stuck replaying it in her mind. That realization made her feel even smaller, but also strangely grateful. He wasn't holding a grudge, and that mattered more than she cared to admit. "I guess I've always been a little too quick to judge people," Karen admitted, her voice quieter now, "especially when it comes to their yards." She forced a nervous laugh, hoping to lighten the mood, but James just nodded thoughtfully. "People see what they want to see," he replied. "I get that. You're protective of your neighborhood. That's not a bad thing. But sometimes, assumptions can lead to trouble. Trust me, I've learned that lesson the hard way." Karen nodded, absorbing his words. There was a depth to him that she hadn't noticed before, a quiet wisdom born from experience. She wanted to ask more about his past, about why he'd chosen this particular neighborhood. But something told her those weren't questions he'd answer easily. Instead, she focused on what she could control, making things right. "Anyway," she said, forcing a small smile, "the cookies are my way of saying thank you. For not calling the cops on me, I mean." She laughed awkwardly, but James chuckled softly, the sound putting her slightly at ease. "They're good," he said after taking a bite. "Thanks." Encouraged by his response, Karen ventured further. "Listen, we're having a neighborhood barbecue next weekend. Nothing fancy, just burgers and hot dogs. I know you probably don't want a lot of attention, but I'd really like it if you came. As a fresh start, you know." James raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the invitation. "A barbecue, huh?" He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Sure, why not? Could be nice to get to know everyone a little better." Relief washed over Karen, followed quickly by determination. This was her chance to make amends, not just with James, but with herself. Over the next few days, she threw herself into planning the event, making sure everything would go smoothly. When the day arrived, she greeted James warmly as he walked up to the gathering, carrying a six-pack of soda and wearing a faint smile. As the evening wore on, Karen found herself laughing more freely than she had in weeks. Watching James chat casually with other neighbors, blending in effortlessly, reminded her that people were rarely what they seemed on the surface. And maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. Life in the neighborhood eventually returned to its usual rhythm, though it carried a new undercurrent of awareness. The barbecue had gone off without a hitch, and James, now known to everyone as Jonathan Hayes, had proven to be surprisingly approachable. He didn't share much about his past, but he listened intently when others spoke, offering thoughtful comments that revealed glimpses of his sharp mind and dry sense of humor. By the end of the evening, several neighbors had exchanged phone numbers with him, inviting him to future gatherings or casual get-togethers. For Karen, watching this transformation was both humbling and heartening. Still, things weren't entirely back to normal. Conversations around the cul-de-sac often veered toward speculation about Jonathan's identity and the circumstances that brought him there. Some whispered theories about high-profile enemies or dramatic escapes, while others marveled at how seamlessly he blended into their quiet suburban world. But for every wild rumor, there were moments of genuine connection. Jonathan began joining the occasional morning walk group and even accepted an invitation to help organize the annual block party. Slowly, he became less of an enigma and more of a neighbor. For Karen, the experience left a lasting mark. She found herself questioning her own tendencies, the way she judged people based on appearances or jumped to conclusions without all the facts. It wasn't easy to unlearn habits formed over decades, but she made a conscious effort to pause before reacting. When she noticed someone's yard looking messy, instead of marching over with her clipboard, she reminded herself of the lesson she'd learned. You never really know what someone is dealing with unless they choose to tell you. The incident also brought the community closer together in unexpected ways. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves started chatting more frequently, sharing stories and laughter over fences and front porches. The annual summer picnic saw record attendance, with Jonathan bringing homemade lemonade that earned rave reviews. Even Karen, who had always prided herself on being the self-appointed yard police, loosened up enough to joke about her infamous confrontation. Let's just say I've learned not to mess with federal agents or their protectees, she quipped during one gathering, earning chuckles from everyone within earshot. As weeks turned into months, Jonathan continued living quietly, grateful for the anonymity the neighborhood afforded him. He appreciated the kindness of his neighbors, especially Karen's attempts to make amends. Though he didn't need constant social interaction, having a supportive community gave him a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. And for Karen, knowing she played a small role in bridging that gap filled her with a quiet pride. Looking back, the whole ordeal served as a reminder that life is full of surprises, and that assumptions can lead us down paths we never intended to take. Karen often thought about how differently things might have gone if she hadn't let her frustration boil over that sunny Saturday morning. Would she have ever discovered the truth about Jonathan, or would they have remained distant acquaintances, separated by misunderstandings and mistrust? In the end, the story became part of local lore, a tale recounted at dinner parties and holiday gatherings. Remember that time, Karen yelled at the Secret Service. Someone would inevitably ask, prompting laughter and nods of recognition. It was a cautionary tale wrapped in humor, a gentle nudge to remind everyone that sometimes it's best to look beyond the surface and embrace the mystery of the people around us. And as Karen stood one crisp autumn afternoon, gazing across the street at Jonathan, tending to his newly trimmed hedges, she smiled to herself. Maybe perfection wasn't about pristine lawns or spotless driveways after all. Maybe it was about finding balance between order and understanding, between curiosity and respect. Whatever it was, she felt lucky to have stumbled upon it, however accidentally.